An angry little boy crashes a billionaire CEO's wedding. How could you forget about mommy? The guests start laughing, thinking it's a prank, before freezing in shock at the billionaire's reaction. The floral arrangements were immaculate, rows of pristine white roses draped over the pews like delicate lace. Chandeliers cast a golden glow across the hall, where hundreds of impeccably dressed guests murmured in excitement, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and champagne. The ceremony had been planned to perfection, not a single detail left unchecked. Victoria Langford stood at the altar in a gown that had been hand-stitched by a European designer, every bead in place, every layer flowing just so. Her smile was poised, her posture flawless. She was exactly what a man like Jackson Harrington was expected to marry, refined, composed, the kind of woman who made the front pages for all the right reasons. Jackson stood beside her, hands loosely clasped in front of him. To anyone watching, he looked like the picture of confidence, the billionaire mogul who had conquered the business world and was now settling into the next great chapter of his life. But beneath the polished exterior, there was a tightness in his chest that he couldn't quite explain, a pressure that had been building all morning. He had always been good at ignoring things that didn't fit neatly into his plans. Pushing forward. Keeping his focus where it mattered. This was just nerves, he told himself. A wedding of this scale came with a level of scrutiny most people couldn't fathom. Cameras flashed from the back of the room, a steady reminder that every movement, every glance, every whisper would be analyzed, discussed, dissected. There was no room for hesitation. The officiant cleared his throat, smiling warmly at the guests before turning back to the couple. We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of... The heavy doors at the end of the hall slammed open. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Heads swiveled, a few guests muttering in confusion, others peering over their shoulders with polite curiosity. At first, no one moved. Then, from the doorway, a small figure stormed forward. The boy was no more than 7, scrawny but full of determination, his sneakers squeaking against the marble floor as he marched down the aisle with the kind of authority that belonged to someone 3 times his size. He was out of breath, chest rising and falling in quick bursts, his messy hair sticking to his forehead as if he had been running. Somewhere in the crowd, someone chuckled. A wedding crasher, probably a distant relative's kid, some bored child who had gotten too excited and wandered into the spotlight. Then he spoke. Stop! His voice cut through the room, high-pitched and unwavering. Muffled laughter spread through the guests. Someone near the front let out an amused scoff. A few people reached for their phones, poised to capture what was clearly an entertaining interruption. Even Victoria, her fingers tightening around her bouquet, glanced at Jackson with a thin, forced smile, expecting him to wave it off so they could continue. Charlie's small frame squared, his hands curling into fists. His face was set with determination, eyes locked onto Jackson. How could you forget about mommy? The laughter died instantly. The room turned heavy, thick with an unfamiliar tension. The amused glances shifted into uncertainty. People started looking at each other, waiting for someone to explain. Victoria's fingers, still wrapped around her bouquet, turned rigid. The officiant hesitated, his practiced composure faltering. The soft hum of whispered confusion filled the space. Jackson felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing into him, but his focus narrowed to the boy in front of him. Everything around him faded. The grandeur of the wedding, the crowd, the cameras, none of it mattered. Because he knew exactly who Charlie was. His breath caught, hands loosening at his sides. He took an instinctive step back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to most, but to the people watching closely, Victoria, the guests in the front rows, the reporters analyzing every shift of his expression, it spoke volumes. Charlie stood his ground, arms folded across his chest. Well? He challenged. Are you just gonna stare at me, or do you have something to say? Jackson's mouth opened, but no words came. He was a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, shut down entire boardrooms with a single glance, built an empire with nothing but sheer willpower. He had faced rivals, lawsuits, economic downturns, scandals, betrayals. And yet, at this moment, a 7-year-old boy had him completely cornered. Victoria finally exhaled, her patience splintering. She turned toward Jackson with a perfectly measured whisper. "What is this?" Jackson didn't answer. His throat felt dry, his thoughts tangled. He should have expected this. He should have known that the past would catch up with him eventually. But he hadn't. Because that part of his life had always felt distant, like something he had left behind so completely that it couldn't possibly resurface. And yet, here Charlie stood. Unmistakably his. The room had gone unbearably silent, but the tension kept building. Charlie's chin lifted. "You don't remember, do you?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something sharp beneath the surface. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised. You forgot about her too." There was no mistaking the accusation in his tone. Somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a slow exhale. The guests, many of them high society figures accustomed to scandals, were starting to piece together what was happening. Jackson took a step forward, but Charlie didn't flinch. If anything, his stance became firmer. This was not a boy who had wandered in by accident. This was a boy with a mission. Victoria's expression remained unreadable, but the subtle clench of her jaw, the way her fingers tightened over the bouquet, spoke louder than words. This was not part of the script. This was not something she had planned for, and Victoria Langford did not like surprises. The officiant, clearly unsure of what to do, let out an awkward cough. "Perhaps we should." Jackson finally found his voice. "Who brought you here?" Charlie didn't even hesitate. "I came by myself." A few gasps fluttered through the room. Someone whispered something about security. A murmur spread among the guests, shifting from confusion to fascination. Charlie crossed his arms again. "You're acting surprised, but you shouldn't be. You know exactly why I'm here." Jackson's throat tightened. The problem was he did. The weight of the moment settled over him, pressing in from all directions. The wedding. The cameras. The guests. The truth. And standing in the middle of it all was a little boy who had just shattered the life he had so carefully built. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in despite the open space of the grand hall. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, a wave of whispers and hushed speculation sweeping through the guests. Someone's champagne flute clinked against the floor, unnoticed in the growing tension. The live orchestra, caught in uncertainty, let their last note trail off into an uneasy silence. It was no longer a wedding. It was a spectacle. Before Jackson could even process the weight of what had just happened, security moved. 2 men in dark suits, earpieces in place, stepped forward to escort Charlie out, their movements swift and professional. He should have expected that. They were trained to handle disruptions quickly and quietly, to remove anything that threatened the smooth execution of an event as high profile as this one. And yet, watching them approach, a sharp discomfort gripped his chest. "No." The word left his mouth before he could think about it. The security guards hesitated mid-step. Jackson swallowed, forcing himself to steady his voice. "Let him talk." They stopped, looking to him for confirmation. He nodded once, and they backed off, melting into the background, but the tension didn't leave the room. Charlie, undeterred, lifted his chin. "So you do have a voice." A few gasps rippled through the guests. Someone stifled a laugh, but the amusement was laced with discomfort. Victoria's expression tightened. Jackson barely noticed. His focus was on the boy standing before him, the one who had crashed his wedding, the one who had just flipped his entire world upside down with a few words. His suit felt stiff, the starched collar suddenly unbearable. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes on him, waiting, expecting him to take control. To shut it down. But how could he? Charlie's small frame didn't waver. "You don't even recognize me, do you?" Jackson exhaled, shaking his head. His pulse was uneven, thoughts tangled. He should have known. He should have felt something the moment he saw him. "Guess that's no surprise," Charlie went on. "Since you forgot about Mommy too." The words hit harder than they should have. The silence that followed was thick, stretching between them like a canyon. It was only broken by the rustle of fabric as Victoria took a sharp step forward, her presence no longer passive. "Jackson," she said through clenched teeth, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "What the hell is going on?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his mind racing. Victoria's patience thinned, her nails digging into the bouquet still clenched in her grip. "Fix this." But how? Charlie was still waiting for an answer. Everyone was. Jackson forced himself to move, to push past the fog in his head and do something. He crouched, leveling himself to the boy's height, steadying his breath. "Who's your mother?" Charlie's stance didn't shift, but there was something sharper in his expression now, something defiant. "Oh, so now you care?" He folded his arms, like he had been expecting this moment, and had already decided how he felt about it. "Her name is Lena Porter. Ring any bells, Dad?" Everything stopped. The name landed like a punch, more effective than anything Charlie could have physically thrown at him. He didn't need to hear more. He didn't need proof. Lena Porter. The past wasn't just knocking, it had kicked the door open and walked straight in. Victoria let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a scoff. "You have got to be kidding me." The weight of it settled over Jackson's shoulders, heavy, suffocating. He had spent years not thinking about Lena, years convincing himself that she had been a piece of another life, one that he had left behind. She had been the girl he once thought he would spend forever with, before forever turned into boardrooms, acquisitions, and sleepless nights chasing something bigger. He had told himself that whatever they had wasn't meant to last. That it had been better this way. But here was the truth, standing in front of him with Lena's fire in his voice and Jackson's own features staring back at him. Charlie let the silence stretch, then huffed. "Right. That's what I thought." Victoria moved again, the stiff rustle of her dress sharp in the thick silence. "I'm not doing this," she muttered, voice clipped. Jackson turned to her, still too off balance to string together an explanation. Not that there was one. The truth was obvious now. Victoria shook her head, not in anger but in cold disbelief. "This is humiliating." And just like that, the tension shifted again. The whispers returned, the subtle judgment hanging between every exchange of glances among the guests. The reporters near the back didn't even try to hide the fact that they were still filming. She turned, walking away, the train of her gown catching on the edge of the step leading down from the altar. The officiant took an awkward step back, looking anywhere but at Jackson. The wedding was ruined. Jackson should have cared. But all he could think about was the boy still staring him down. His head was still spinning, but he forced himself to think beyond the chaos, beyond the guests, beyond the life he had built so carefully. He turned, catching sight of his assistant lingering near the edge of the venue, phone in hand, looking like he was already one step ahead of the disaster control team. Jackson lifted a hand, signaling. "Take him somewhere private." "Now." Charlie's eyes flashed. "I'm not going anywhere with some weird guy in a suit." Jackson exhaled, pushing down the headache building behind his eyes. "I'll come to you when I'm done here." Charlie hesitated, then let out an exaggerated sigh, like this entire thing had been exhausting for him, too. He started walking toward the exit, but before he stepped out, he turned back. "You can play rich businessman all you want, but you're still the guy who broke my mom's heart." Then he was gone. The whispers grew louder. The questions would come. The headlines were already being written. The woman he had promised to marry was walking away, heels clicking against the polished floor, her exit as cold as her silence. But none of that mattered. For the first time in years, Jackson was staring at the wreckage of something he had broken a long time ago. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix it. The venue emptied out in a slow, awkward shuffle. Guests murmured amongst themselves, slipping past each other with sidelong glances and hushed speculation. Some, the ones who lived for high society drama, lingered longer than necessary, waiting to see if Jackson would attempt to salvage the wedding. He didn't. The reception was cancelled before the last chair was even tucked away. The orchestra packed up, the caterers hesitated, and his assistant fielded calls from reporters who had already turned the ruined wedding into tomorrow's headline. It didn't matter. Jackson sat in the back of his car, silent as the city blurred past the tinted windows. Victoria had called once. He hadn't answered. Maybe he would later, when he had the energy to deal with whatever sharp-edged farewell she had prepared, but right now, there was only one thing on his mind. Lena. He wasn't sure why the name felt so heavy in his head. It had been years, long enough that she should have been a distant memory, someone who existed in old photographs stuffed in boxes he never opened. She was part of the past, and Jackson had never been the type to look back. His life had been built on momentum, on forward motion, on never stopping long enough to let regret catch up to him. But regret was sitting somewhere in his house right now, arms crossed, staring at him like he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. The car pulled up to his estate, the iron gates closing behind them with a low hum. Jackson barely noticed. He stepped out, rolling his shoulders back as if that would somehow prepare him for the conversation ahead. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the faint murmur of his assistant speaking with security near the entrance. He followed the sound, finding Charlie seated in his study, small but defiant in the oversized leather chair behind his desk. A glass of water sat untouched in front of him. His sneakers tapped a slow rhythm against the leg of the chair. Charlie didn't look up right away. "Took you long enough." Jackson exhaled. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, least of all by a child. He should have been annoyed. He wasn't. He sat down across from him, studying the boy who had shattered his carefully constructed life in under 5 minutes. Charlie wasn't intimidated. If anything, he looked vaguely entertained. "You're really bad at this dad thing," he said, head tilting. "I had a whole speech planned. You were supposed to deny everything, then I'd prove you wrong with a dramatic DNA test. But you already look guilty." Jackson ran a hand down his face, exhaustion settling in. "Your mom never told me about you." Charlie let out a quiet scoff, leaning back. "Yeah, well, you also never asked." The words hit sharper than he expected. He should have had an answer for that. He didn't. Silence stretched between them. Jackson shifted, elbows resting against the arms of the chair. "Where is she?" Charlie's smirk faded. He looked away, fingers tightening around the hem of his hoodie. Jackson sat up straighter. "Charlie." The boy hesitated, then let out a breath. "She's sick," he muttered. "That's why I came." Jackson's jaw tightened. The words felt heavier than they should have. "What kind of sick?" Charlie hesitated again, shifting uncomfortably, as if saying it out loud would make it worse. "She's been tired a lot. Coughing. She used to work full shifts, but now she barely makes it through half." He swallowed. "I don't know everything, okay? But I know we need help." Jackson's grip tightened on the arms of his chair. Charlie's words shouldn't have rattled him as much as they did. But it was the way he said them, like he had been carrying that weight on his small shoulders for longer than any child should. He had spent years convincing himself that Lena had moved on, that whatever they had in the past had been left there, neatly wrapped and forgotten. He had never considered, never even entertained the idea, that she had been raising his son alone. And now she was sick, and the kid she had raised by herself was the one standing in front of him, demanding answers that he didn't have. For the first time in years, money didn't feel like a solution. Charlie's fingers drummed against the desk, restless. "I'm guessing you have, like, a million questions." Jackson took a slow breath. "A few." Charlie shrugged. "You can ask, but I'm not gonna tell you everything. I don't trust you yet." The honesty was like a punch to the ribs. Jackson hadn't expected warmth, but hearing it laid out so plainly did something to him. He hadn't realized how much he wanted this kid to trust him until the words confirmed that he didn't. Charlie hopped down from the chair, stretching. "So, what now?" Jackson watched him, still processing everything. He had spent a lifetime fixing problems with strategy, negotiation, precision. But there was no blueprint for this. "I find your mother." Charlie studied him, weighing his response like a judge deciding a sentence. Then he nodded, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his hoodie. "Good. Just don't screw it up." He walked toward the door, pausing once to glance over his shoulder. "You do that a lot, don't you?" Jackson frowned. "Do what?" Charlie shrugged. "Leave people behind." The words shouldn't have stung. But they did. Charlie left the room, and Jackson was left sitting in the quiet, his carefully controlled world crumbling piece by piece. There were still 100 things to do, fallout to deal with, calls to make, but none of it mattered. He reached for his phone. It was time to find Lena Porter. The next morning, Jackson woke up to a world that had shifted overnight. His phone was a mess of unread messages, his PR team scrambling to contain the damage, board members demanding explanations, and Victoria leaving a single, final voicemail that he didn't bother listening to. The media had latched onto the scandal like vultures. His face was plastered across every news outlet with headlines speculating on the dramatic downfall of Jackson Harrington, the billionaire left at the altar by a secret past. It was chaos, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Charlie, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. He strolled into the dining room that morning like he owned the place, still wearing the same hoodie from yesterday, his sneakers tapping against the marble floor as he eyed the elaborate spread laid out on the table. Trays of fresh fruit, eggs, pastries, and imported coffee sat untouched, arranged by a chef who had no idea that the only guest this morning was a 7-year-old with an attitude. Charlie grabbed a croissant, tearing off a piece as he plopped into a chair. "So, do rich people just sit in their mansions all day? No wonder you have no friends." Jackson set down his coffee, already exhausted. "I have business meetings." Charlie made a face. "Wow. Sounds thrilling." The sarcasm was almost impressive. Jackson sighed, glancing at his assistant, who stood by the door, looking as though he wasn't sure if he should intervene. The man had been working around the clock, tracking down Lena, sifting through old records and contacts, making calls Jackson hadn't thought he'd ever need to make. "We found her," the assistant finally said. Charlie perked up instantly, shoving the rest of the croissant into his mouth. "Took you long enough." Jackson stood, adjusting his jacket. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing about this was going to be easy. The drive wasn't long, but it felt stretched out, the silence between them thick with something unspoken. Charlie tapped his fingers against the car door, shifting impatiently in his seat. Jackson had questions, more than he could count, but none that would get him the answers he really needed. What kind of life had Lena built without him? How had she managed on her own all these years? Why hadn't she reached out? Charlie broke the silence first. "So, how rich are you?" Jackson sighed. "Why?" Charlie shrugged. "Just wondering if you're the kind of rich that buys islands or the kind that makes people sign contracts before they eat dinner with you." Jackson didn't answer. Charlie smirked like he'd won something. They pulled up in front of a small apartment complex, the kind with aging bricks and windows that rattled in the wind. It was nothing like the places Jackson had grown used to. No towering ceilings, no doorman, no sleek black cars lining the curb. It was quiet, modest, the kind of place built for people who worked long hours and counted every paycheck. Jackson hesitated a fraction too long before stepping out of the car. Charlie didn't wait for him, already making his way up the steps like this was routine. He knocked 3 quick raps against the wood. The door opened. Lena stood there, looking between them, her fingers still curled around the doorknob. For the first time in years, Jackson was completely, utterly speechless. She wasn't the girl he remembered from college, not exactly. There were traces of her, of course, the same sharp, intelligent gaze, the way she carried herself, the familiarity in the way she tilted her head slightly as if she was trying to decide what to say. But she looked different, too. There was exhaustion in the way she held herself, and the slight slump of her shoulders, in the way she leaned against the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He realized then that he had been expecting her to be the same girl he left behind, frozen in time. She wasn't. Lena's lips pressed together before she finally exhaled. "I told you not to do this, Charlie." Charlie shrugged. "You also told me to eat my vegetables, but we both know how that turned out." She sighed, stepping back to let him in. Her gaze flickered to Jackson, unreadable. She had to have known this moment was coming, yet she still looked like she wasn't entirely convinced he was standing there. He forced himself to speak. "Lena." She met his gaze, and for a moment, everything around them felt suspended. Charlie rolled his eyes. "So, are you guys gonna stare at each other, or are we gonna have a dramatic family reunion?" Lena let out a tired laugh, shaking her head. "Charlie, go get some juice from the fridge." The boy huffed but obeyed, disappearing into the kitchen. The second he was out of sight, the air between them shifted. Jackson took a step forward. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lena leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. "Would you have stayed?" The question hit harder than it should have. Jackson didn't have an answer, and that was the problem. Lena let the silence stretch before shaking her head. "That's why I didn't tell you." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "Lena, She held up a hand. Don't stand here and act like we can go back and change what happened. It's done. You made your choices, and I made mine." He clenched his jaw. "And what about Charlie?" "That wasn't his choice." Her expression flickered just briefly before she shook her head. "You're right. It wasn't." She sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "Look, Jackson, I'm tired. I don't have the energy to rehash the past right now. If you're here to write a check and feel better about yourself, don't bother." His chest tightened. "You think that's why I'm here?" Lena let out a dry laugh. "Isn't it?" "No." His voice came out sharper than he expected. He took a slow breath, trying to find his footing in a conversation that had no script, no strategy. "I didn't know about him, Lena. You didn't give me the chance to. And if I had? What would you have done?" Another question he didn't have an answer for. Before he could try, Charlie returned, a juice box in hand. "Did I miss anything?" Lena shook her head, already reaching for her keys. "I have to pick up my prescription. If you two want to sit around and argue, do it somewhere else." Charlie frowned. "I can go with you." She hesitated but sighed. "Fine. Let's go." Charlie turned to Jackson. "You coming?" Jackson looked between them, feeling a shift in his own chest that he couldn't quite name. "Yes," he said. "I am." Lena didn't argue. She just turned, leading the way out the door. For the first time in his life, Jackson followed. Jackson wasn't sure what had shifted inside him that day, but something had. The moment he stepped out of Lena's apartment and back into the sleek black car waiting for him, the world he had built over the years felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. The towering offices, the board meetings, the carefully curated life, it all seemed disconnected from what really mattered. He had spent his career making decisions with absolute certainty, calculating risks and maximizing returns. But this wasn't business. This was a life he had unknowingly left behind, and now he had no strategy, no roadmap for fixing what had already been broken. So, he did what he had always done when facing an obstacle: he kept showing up. At first, Lena wasn't thrilled. The second time he appeared outside her apartment, carrying a bag of groceries, she barely gave him a glance before crossing her arms and leaning against the doorframe. "What is this?" "You need food." Her eyebrow lifted. "I know. That's why I buy it myself." He ignored her and stepped inside, placing the bags on the counter. Charlie, who had been sprawled on the couch with a comic book, barely looked up before sighing dramatically. "This again? You do realize this is getting weird, right?" Jackson didn't respond, unpacking the groceries with a focus usually reserved for mergers. Lena shook her head, rubbing her temples. I don't need rescuing, Jackson. I'm not trying to rescue you. Then what are you doing? He hesitated but didn't stop moving. Making up for lost time. She exhaled like she had expected that answer and didn't quite believe it. This isn't something you can fix by throwing money at it. I know. Charlie sat up, watching them. So, does this mean you're, officially part of our lives now? Because if so, I should warn you, I'm very expensive to keep. Jackson shot him a look. You're 7. Charlie shrugged. And I require snacks. Lots of them. Lena muttered something under her breath, shaking her head as she grabbed a can from one of the bags. Fine. But don't make a habit of this. He did. A few days later, he showed up again, this time unannounced, standing outside Charlie's school as the children streamed out for the day. The moment Charlie spotted him, his entire body slumped like he had just been sentenced to public humiliation. You've got to be kidding me. Charlie groaned, trudging toward him. Are you stalking me now? I was in the area. Jackson lied. Charlie gave him a flat look. You live across town. Jackson didn't answer, just gestured to the car. Charlie muttered something about rich people and their weird hobbies, but climbed in anyway. It became a routine, one that neither of them openly acknowledged. Jackson started learning the smaller things, the details he had missed. How Charlie liked his sandwiches cut in triangles, how he always had at least one bandage on his knee from some disaster on the playground, how he talked a mile a minute when he was excited but pretended to be indifferent about everything. Lena continued to resist. She argued every time Jackson tried to help, every time he showed up with something useful, every time he inserted himself into the life she had built without him. But for all her protests, she never actually stopped him. The real test came when he decided to fix her sink. It had started as an observation. He had noticed the slow drip of water while helping Charlie with his homework, the rhythmic plink, plink, plink that filled the silence between their sentences. Charlie had shrugged when Jackson mentioned it. It's been like that forever. Mom keeps meaning to call someone, but she's busy. Jackson had never fixed a sink in his life, but he had built billion-dollar companies, led thousands of employees, managed crises that made men crumble. How hard could one faucet be? Charlie watched with barely contained amusement as Jackson pulled up a tutorial on his phone. He followed the steps carefully, his confidence steady. Until it wasn't. Something slipped. A bolt turned the wrong way. Water shot out like a geyser, drenching him instantly. Charlie howled with laughter, gripping the counter for support as he doubled over. Oh, this is amazing. Mom! You need to see this! Lena walked in just as another stream of water hit Jackson square in the chest. She froze, stared, then covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. What are you doing? Jackson, soaked, wiped a hand down his face, muttering something under his breath as he reached for the shut-off valve. Charlie was still gasping for air, tears in his eyes from laughing too hard. You look so confident, and then... He dissolved into another fit of laughter, kicking his feet against the cabinets. Lena shook her head, grabbed a towel, and tossed it at Jackson. For someone so smart, you are incredibly bad at this. The faucet still leaked. But for the first time, Jackson felt like part of something real. A few nights later, Charlie handed him a piece of folded paper. Jackson opened it, expecting another sarcastic note. Instead, it was a drawing. 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, one small, standing together under a bright blue sky. He stared at it longer than he meant to. What's this? Charlie shrugged, stuffing his hands in his pockets like he suddenly didn't care. Just some dumb school project. Jackson folded the paper carefully and slid it into his wallet, right behind his business cards. Charlie pretended not to notice. But he smiled. Jackson had spent his life negotiating multimillion-dollar deals, handling ruthless competitors, and making decisions that affected entire industries. He had faced economic downturns, hostile takeovers, and market collapses. None of it compared to the nerves twisting in his stomach when he stood outside Lena's apartment, debating whether to knock. It had been weeks since Charlie crashed his wedding, and in that time, Jackson had managed to become part of his son's life in a way he hadn't expected. He picked him up from school, helped with homework, learned more than he ever wanted to about cartoons and playground politics. He had adjusted, awkwardly, but he had adjusted. Lena, however, remained a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. She tolerated him, even let him linger in her life, but there was always a distance, an invisible line she refused to let him cross. That was why he was here. When he finally knocked, Lena opened the door, arms crossed, leaning against the frame with that same guarded expression she always wore around him. He exhaled and got straight to the point. "Have dinner with me." She blinked. "What?" "Dinner," he repeated. "Just you and me. No Charlie." Her lips parted slightly, and for once, she looked genuinely caught off guard. "You're asking me out?" "Yes." He paused. "And before you say no, it's not some guilt-driven attempt to fix the past. I want to be with you. I want to talk. Just us." She studied him for a moment, searching for the catch. "I don't need you trying to make up for lost time with some grand, sweeping gesture, Jackson." "Good," he said. "Because I was thinking something simple." Lena hesitated, then exhaled, shaking her head like she already knew she was going to regret this. "Fine. But we eat where normal people eat. No five-star restaurants. No private chefs. No weird molecular food science nonsense." He gave a short nod. "Deal." 15 minutes later, Jackson realized he had made a terrible mistake. The diner Lena chose was a far cry from the places he was used to. The neon sign flickered, the walls were covered in framed photos of old customers and local celebrities, and the air smelled like coffee, grilled cheese, and grease. The laminated menus were slightly sticky, and the waitress greeted Lena by name before handing them 2 plastic-covered menus. Jackson turned his over, scanning the options with the focus of a man trying to decipher a foreign language. "What's a patty melt?" Lena snorted, the sound so unexpected that he looked up. She was actually laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. "I forgot how helpless you are with normal food," she said, shaking her head. "It's a burger on toasted bread, Jackson. Relax." He wasn't relaxed. Not even a little. He was out of his element, and Lena knew it. He could negotiate corporate mergers in his sleep, but here, in a small-town diner, he was the outsider. And yet, for the first time in a long time, he didn't hate it. When the waitress returned, Lena ordered without looking at the menu. Jackson, still skeptical, ordered the patty melt under Lena's amused gaze. The conversation was light at first, easier than he expected. They talked about Charlie, about his ability to talk his way out of trouble, about the time he tried to sell candy bars at school at a markup to fund his education. "He told the principal he was building a future," Lena said, shaking her head. "I had to go in and pretend I was deeply sorry while secretly trying not to laugh." Jackson smirked. "So he gets that from you?" Lena arched a brow. "Excuse me? You always had a way of making things work in your favor," he said. "Charlie's just following your example." She rolled her eyes, but there was a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. The food arrived, and for a while, they just ate, the comfortable silence between them feeling almost natural. But Jackson wasn't here just to enjoy an old memory. He was here because there was something more he wanted. "I want to be part of his life," he said finally, setting down his fork. Lena stiffened slightly, the ease from before slipping away. "You already are. I don't just mean picking him up from school or fixing your sink." She sighed, pushing her plate aside. "Jackson, I'm not going anywhere this time," he said before she could shut him down. "I know I don't get to waltz in and act like none of this happened. I know I messed up. But I want to do this right." Lena leaned back in the booth, arms crossed. "You don't get to swoop in and fix everything with one nice dinner." "I know," he said. "But let me try." She looked away, pressing her lips together like she was weighing something in her head. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. Charlie deserves stability. Not a dad who might disappear again the second he gets bored. The words hit their mark. He felt them. He could have defended himself, could have told her that he wasn't the same man who left all those years ago, that he wouldn't leave again. But she had no reason to believe that. So, he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded. The conversation shifted after that, the warmth from before replaced by something more cautious, more careful. Jackson paid for dinner, Lena rolled her eyes but let him, and they walked back to the car in silence. Before she got in, she turned to him, hesitating. Charlie's a good kid. Don't mess with his head, Jackson. I won't. Lena studied him for a second longer, then nodded before getting into the car. Jackson stood there for a moment, exhaling slowly before following. The night hadn't gone how he planned. But he was still in the game. And this time, he wasn't backing down. Jackson had barely made it through his morning coffee when his phone started vibrating non-stop. His assistant had called 3 times before he finally picked up, the urgency in the man's voice cutting straight through the morning fog in his brain. Sir, is everything okay? Jackson frowned. Why wouldn't it be? Well, it's just. Your entire weekend has been cleared from your schedule. No meetings, no calls, nothing. Jackson blinked. I didn't do that. His assistant hesitated. Yes, well, I gathered as much after I received a very peculiar call from someone claiming to be your son. A pause. My what? I assumed it was some kind of prank at first, but he was very insistent. The assistant cleared his throat, sounding unsure for the first time in his career. He said, and I quote, Hi, this is Charlie. My dad is busy being a real dad this weekend. Cancel everything. Bye. Jackson pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. Tell me you didn't actually clear my schedule. I tried to confirm with you, but he hung up before I could ask. And well, I assumed, given the recent developments, you might have authorized it. Jackson exhaled slowly. I'll handle it. He hung up and grabbed his jacket, already making his way to the car. By the time he knocked on Lena's door, he was still mildly confused, slightly amused, and mostly wondering how much trouble he was about to walk into. Lena opened the door, arms crossed, one brow raised. I assume you're here because of Charlie? Jackson didn't answer right away, glancing past her into the apartment where Charlie was sprawled across the couch, casually flipping through TV channels like he hadn't just upended his father's entire weekend. Did you tell my board I was on a dad retreat this weekend? Charlie smirked, the remote still in his hand. You're welcome. Jackson stared at him, trying to decide if he should be annoyed or impressed. Probably both. You hacked my calendar? Charlie scoffed. Hacked is a strong word. More like redirected corporate inefficiencies. Lena let out a slow breath. Charlie. He shrugged. What? It's not my fault his schedule is easier to access than my school's Wi-Fi. Jackson ran a hand over his jaw. So, just to be clear, I now have an entire free weekend because a 7-year-old decided I should? Charlie grinned. Seems that way. Lena shook her head but didn't look entirely mad about it. What exactly was your plan, genius? Charlie sat up, resting his elbows on his knees. Simple. We go somewhere. Together. No business, no phone calls, no urgent matters. Just us. Jackson exhaled, leaning against the doorframe. And if I had said no? Charlie smirked. That wasn't really an option. Lena looked between them, clearly debating whether to intervene, then sighed. Fine. But I'm driving. Jackson held up his hands in mock surrender. Wouldn't dream of arguing. Lena didn't wait for a response, already grabbing her keys. 2 hours later, Jackson found himself standing at the edge of a quiet lake, completely out of his element, holding a fishing rod that Charlie had shoved into his hands with way too much enthusiasm. This feels Unnecessary, Jackson muttered, adjusting his grip. Charlie rolled his eyes. You're in a suit. I wasn't given time to change. Charlie looked him up and down. You should have made time. Lena was sitting a few feet away on a blanket, pretending to read but clearly enjoying the spectacle as Jackson fumbled with the rod. Charlie let out an exaggerated sigh and plopped down beside him. Okay, first things first. Try not to look like you're about to negotiate a merger with the fish. Jackson gave him a flat look. Is that how you're teaching me? I'm 7. You're supposed to figure this out on your own. Jackson muttered something under his breath but followed Charlie's instructions as best as he could. He cast the line out, the reel clicking as it spun, landing in the water with a soft plunk. Charlie clapped his hands together. Not completely terrible. Jackson gave him a dry look. High praise. They sat there for a while, the lake stretching wide in front of them, the afternoon sun reflecting off the surface in soft ripples. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet Jackson wasn't used to. Charlie shifted beside him, his tone more casual now. So, what do you actually do all day? Jackson smirked slightly. You mean aside from attending surprise dad retreats? Charlie grinned but nudged him with his elbow. Come on. Like for real. Jackson exhaled, glancing at the lake. Meetings. Calls. Problem solving. Charlie made a face. So. Boring. Lena, still pretending to read, smirked behind her book. Jackson gave Charlie a pointed look. You know, there was a time when I enjoyed it. Charlie propped his chin on his hand. Yeah? What happened? Jackson was quiet for a moment. I met you. Charlie blinked, his usual quick comeback suddenly absent. He shifted slightly, pretending to adjust his fishing rod. Yeah, well, I guess that's an okay answer. Lena finally looked up, watching them. There was something softer in the way she studied them now, like she was seeing something she hadn't let herself believe was possible. Jackson felt it too. He had spent his life chasing success, building something bigger, something lasting. But right now, sitting on the edge of a quiet lake with his son beside him and Lena nearby, this was what felt real. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was missing something. The lake trip had been the first time in a long while that Jackson felt something other than control, other than the relentless drive to move forward. He hadn't realized how much he needed to just exist outside of boardrooms and stock markets, to sit on the shore of a quiet lake with Charlie, failing miserably at fishing and listening to Lena's voice drift in the breeze. It was unfamiliar, and yet it was something he wanted more than anything. As the last night of the trip settled in, the air cooled, and the three of them sat by the fire pit outside the small cabin they had rented. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the wooden deck, the scent of burning wood mixing with the faint trace of the lake air. Charlie was roasting a marshmallow, eyes narrowed in concentration, while Lena sat with her legs pulled up on the chair, gazing at the fire in silence. It felt easy in a way that nothing had ever felt for Jackson, like the version of his life that had been waiting for him all along. Charlie shifted, then reached into his pocket. So, I found something. Jackson glanced over, distracted by the way Charlie was now holding out a small velvet ring box. He nearly choked on his drink, coughing as Charlie held it up casually, turning it over in his hands like it was a toy. Relax, Charlie said, barely sparing him a glance. It's not yours. It's Mom's. She kept it. Jackson froze. He knew exactly what was inside before Charlie even popped the lid open. The ring had barely changed. A simple but elegant design, nothing flashy, nothing gaudy, just a silver band with a single, perfectly cut stone. He had chosen it all those years ago because it had reminded him of Lena, uncomplicated, real, something that didn't need excess to be beautiful. He had given it to her in a moment of certainty, young and stupid and convinced that nothing in the world could pull them apart. And now here it was. Lena turned just in time to see what Charlie was holding. Her entire body tensed as she sat up straight. Charlie, where did you get that? Charlie shrugged, unbothered. Found it in your drawer. You had no right to take that. Lena's voice was sharp, but underneath it was something else, something unsteady. Jackson wasn't looking at Charlie anymore. His focus was on Lena, and for the first time since this entire mess started, he saw something in her that she had been trying to hide: hesitation, vulnerability, something she had spent years burying. You kept it, he said quietly, holding the ring between his fingers. Lena crossed her arms, looking away. I meant to pawn it years ago. But you didn't. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that stretched too long. Charlie watched them like a spectator at a play, his marshmallow forgotten. Lena exhaled, rubbing her hands over her jeans. I was afraid if I let it go, I'd let us go, too. Jackson swallowed hard. He hadn't expected that. He had expected an excuse, a brush off, maybe even an argument. Not this. He didn't rush her. Instead, he reached over and gently placed the ring back in her palm, curling her fingers around it. Then hold on to it, he said. When you're ready. Lena didn't say anything, just sat there, her hands still closed around the ring, her shoulders no longer tense. And for the first time, Jackson felt something shift between them, not a grand declaration, not an instant fix, but something real. She finally smiled. Months passed. Things didn't go back to normal, because there was no normal to return to. There was only now. Jackson didn't push. He let things unfold the way they needed to. Some days Lena let him in. Other days she kept her walls up. Charlie, of course, was less complicated. He demanded Jackson's presence in his life the same way he had crashed his wedding, with full confidence and absolutely no subtlety. The three of them were attending a wedding together, one of Lena's friends from work. It was nothing like the one Jackson had left behind. It was small, intimate, the kind of wedding where people actually knew each other, where laughter echoed across the room instead of the forced perfection of an extravagant ballroom. Jackson sat at the table with Charlie beside him, watching as the bride and groom shared their first dance. Lena was across the room, talking to a friend, her expression relaxed in a way it hadn't been in a long time. Charlie leaned over. We're totally crashing your wedding one day. Jackson smirked, glancing at him. Not if I invite you first. Charlie snorted, grabbing a bread roll from the basket in front of him. Yeah, okay. Good luck with that. Across the room, Lena's gaze met Jackson's. She didn't look away this time. She just nodded, just slightly. And that was enough. They weren't perfect. They weren't tied up neatly in a picture-perfect ending. But they were a family. And that was real. Jackson stood on the porch of Lena's apartment, staring at the small flower pot resting on the step. Charlie had left a note stuck beneath the pot, reminding Jackson to water it if he was going to keep hanging around like a stray cat. It was a moment that made Jackson smile, and he realized how much had changed in the past few months. He had learned to navigate grocery stores, pick Charlie up from school without complaining about traffic, and fix little things around the apartment, though he still wasn't great at any kind of plumbing. He had attended parent-teacher conferences, explained math problems, and offered advice on sports, even though Charlie swore he'd never listen. Sometimes, Jackson caught Lena watching him fold laundry or scrub dishes, her expression unreadable. When he asked if something was wrong, she'd shrug and say, I'm still not used to this. He understood. She had managed so long on her own that an extra pair of hands felt foreign, like a new arrangement that had yet to prove itself. He remembered the first few times he tried to insert himself into their routines. Lena had been so guarded, and Charlie had been so quick with his witty remarks, using humor to mask how badly he wanted a father who showed up. Despite the jokes, Charlie was serious about making Jackson earn it. Over time, the three of them settled into a fragile sort of normal. Jackson discovered that making dinner was harder than finalizing million-dollar contracts, that a leaking roof in a small apartment could feel more daunting than negotiating with investors. And at night, when Charlie had finally gone to bed, Jackson and Lena would talk in hushed tones, about small things, big things, and everything in between. He learned about how she stayed up late worrying over Charlie's future, how she sometimes wondered if letting Jackson in was a mistake. He would listen, never pushing her to feel something she wasn't ready for. In return, she began letting him help in ways that went beyond money or errands. She let him drive Charlie to weekend activities without her, invited him to birthday parties for Charlie's classmates, and sometimes even let her guard down enough to smile when he teased her about how many coffee mugs she owned. They found reasons to spend time together that felt genuine rather than forced. On some weekends, they'd take the car out to the edge of the city and explore small towns, stopping in thrift shops and old diners. Charlie would roll his eyes every time Jackson asked about local menu items, reminding him that not everyone needed a 5-star chef to cook a burger. Occasionally, Jackson would catch himself longing for a different life, but not in the way he used to. Instead of thinking about corporate expansions and shareholder satisfaction, he pictured lazy Sunday mornings with Charlie in the living room, cartoons on the TV, and Lena sipping her coffee, telling them both to turn the volume down. Every day felt like a subtle shift away from the man he was and toward the man he wanted to become, and he knew it was all because Lena and Charlie gave him a chance to try again. One Friday evening, Jackson found himself at a hardware store, picking up supplies to fix a loose cabinet handle in Lena's kitchen. He had resisted the urge to hire a professional, remembering Charlie's gleeful teasing the last time he tried something himself. But he wanted to learn, to see if he could be the kind of person who solved everyday problems instead of delegating them. As he browsed the aisles, his phone buzzed with messages from executives asking if he could join a last-minute conference call to finalize a merger. He stared at the phone, tempted to say yes, but then he remembered how Charlie had looked last weekend when Jackson had canceled their fishing plans to deal with an emergency at the office. The disappointment on that boy's face had lingered for days. Closing the phone without replying, Jackson grabbed the tools he needed and headed to the register, ignoring the nagging sensation that he was walking away from a high-stakes deal. When he arrived at Lena's apartment that night, Charlie opened the door, gave him a mock salute, and pointed to the kitchen. Jackson put down the tools, removed his jacket, and set to work while Charlie supervised. Lena was out at a late shift, so the two of them spent the evening with the radio on low, chatting about trivial things. Charlie asked him about his childhood, and Jackson found himself admitting that he had once tried to run a lemonade stand, only to lose interest after a few days. Charlie laughed, calling him a quitter, and Jackson countered that at least he hadn't tried to scalp candy bars like Charlie did. They kept at it, friendly bickering back and forth, the sound of the radio mixing with the gentle noise of a city night. By the time Lena got home, Jackson had fixed the cabinet handle, though he'd accidentally nicked the wood in the process. Charlie made sure to point that out, but Lena only shook her head, calling it an improvement anyway. A few weeks later, Charlie had another bright idea. He found Jackson rummaging in the closet for extra blankets, took a seat on the couch, and announced that it was time for a bigger step. Jackson, still half buried in the closet, asked what he meant, and Charlie stated that since everything had been going so well, maybe Jackson should take Lena on an actual date again, except this time, do it right. Jackson reminded Charlie of the last date in that diner, how it ended with Lena's walls going back up the moment he mentioned the future. Charlie rolled his eyes, explaining that the only reason she resisted was because she was scared he'd disappear again. "Prove you won't," Charlie said in a matter-of-fact tone, like it was the simplest thing in the world. That set Jackson's mind turning. He recalled the ring Charlie had dug up at the lake, the old promise he once made to Lena. The ring was still in Lena's possession, tucked away in a drawer somewhere, kept out of sight. She wasn't ready to wear it, but she also hadn't pawned it as she once claimed she'd do. Jackson wondered what it would mean if he suggested something more permanent. Part of him shied away from the idea, certain it was too soon, that Lena might retreat if he pushed. But another part of him recognized that he wasn't content to float in the limbo of half-commitment. He wanted a life with her and Charlie, something solid and lasting, without the lingering possibility that he'd walk away or she'd slam the door on him. He took Lena to a small art gallery downtown the next Saturday. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a moment where they could share something outside of daily responsibilities. She admired the paintings, occasionally making a teasing remark about how Jackson should sponsor local artists instead of global corporations. He smiled, mentioning that he'd been thinking of branching out his philanthropy, and she raised an eyebrow in surprise. She seemed to be seeing him in a different light, as though he was truly adapting to a simpler world. They ended the evening at a little bistro that didn't take reservations. He waited in line with her, surrounded by couples on date night, families with impatient children, and the hum of conversations echoing off brick walls. Lena's posture softened as they talked about random memories, how they used to sneak cheap pizza back in college, how Jackson once tried to impress her by booking a fancy rooftop restaurant before he had any money. They laughed about how out of place they had felt, how the waiter probably knew Jackson's suit was borrowed. By the time they sat down, Jackson could sense that something had changed. Lena was letting him see more of her, letting him close enough to feel a quiet hope that maybe it wasn't too late for them to find something worth keeping. He spent that night at his own place, feeling restless. The big house felt too large without Charlie's chatter or Lena's firm instructions about not leaving his shoes near the door. The emptiness seemed to emphasize how different his priorities had become. Glancing out the window at the city lights, he recalled the day Charlie discovered the ring, and how Lena confessed she'd been afraid that letting go of the ring meant letting go of them entirely. He decided, in that moment, that he would make her an offer she could refuse, but hopefully wouldn't. The next afternoon, he invited them both to a small picnic spot just outside the city. It was a place Charlie and Lena had visited once when Charlie was younger. Lena mentioned it in passing, saying it was a peaceful retreat, but that she rarely had time to go anymore. He prepared lunch himself, sandwiches, fruit, and a few snacks he hoped Charlie would find acceptable. They sat on a worn blanket under a large tree, dappled sunlight shifting through the leaves. Charlie dug into the food like he hadn't eaten in days, and Lena sipped lemonade, glancing around with the look of someone remembering a place fondly. Halfway through their meal, Jackson cleared his throat and asked Charlie to go check the car for a cooler bag. Charlie rolled his eyes, obviously catching on to the fact that he was being pushed away for a private conversation, but he went without protest. Once Charlie was out of earshot, Jackson turned to Lena, carefully taking out a small, refurbished jewelry box from his pocket. She immediately tensed, her defenses rising. "I know what you're thinking," he said, keeping his tone calm. "And I'm not here to corner you." She watched him closely. "Then what are you doing?" He opened the box. Inside was the ring Charlie had first produced by the lakeside. It caught the light, reminding them both of a time when things were simpler, and all they had in front of them was possibility. Jackson spoke slowly. "We've changed a lot since we were those kids in college. You might still think I'm the same person who walked away. I don't blame you for that. But I'm here now, and I love you and Charlie more than I know how to say. I'm not the person who left, and I never want to be that person again. This is me asking if you'll take another chance on me." Lena pressed her lips together, staring at the ring. "I keep telling you I don't want grand gestures." "I know," he said. "This isn't a grand gesture. It's an honest one. I want to marry you, but only if it's what you want too. If you tell me you're not ready, I'll wait. If you say you don't want this, I'll keep showing up anyway." She took the ring in her hand, and for a long moment she studied it without speaking. Then she looked at Jackson, her defenses slowly melting. "I've been scared. Scared that if I say yes, you'll disappear when things get tough again. I won't," he promised. She inhaled, setting the ring down on the blanket. Then she slid her arms around him, resting her head against his chest. It wasn't a dramatic kiss or a tearful embrace, just a moment of acceptance. "Then my answer is yes." The wedding was small, held in the same place Charlie had forced Jackson into, that impromptu dad retreat, a quaint lakeside spot where they could keep the guest list short and the atmosphere calm. There were no reporters, no business moguls comparing contracts in the aisles, no cameras flashing in search of sensational headlines. Instead, there were close friends of Lena's, a few of Jackson's colleagues who had become genuine friends, and one extremely excited boy who took his role as ring bearer very seriously. Lena wore a simple white dress, nothing too extravagant. Jackson stood at the front, trying not to let his nerves show. He glanced at Charlie, who gave him a tiny, confident nod. The ceremony began, accompanied by gentle music that one of Lena's friends played on a guitar. When she walked down the makeshift aisle, Jackson felt like it was the first time he was truly seeing the moment he'd always wanted. She wasn't just the girl he used to love in college. She was the woman who had faced life's challenges without him, raised their child on her own, and let him back in when she had every reason not to. When Lena joined him, Charlie stood by her side, full of pride and excitement. The officiant spoke about commitment, unity, and the importance of building a life together, but Jackson barely registered the words. He was too caught up in the fact that he was here, that Lena had chosen him despite everything, that Charlie was part of this and was beaming like he'd orchestrated the whole event himself. They exchanged vows that they had written themselves. Lena's were honest, acknowledging the past but also looking toward a future she was finally ready to believe in. Jackson's were a promise to never run again, to never put business above family, and to show up for Charlie and Lena no matter how difficult life became. When they slipped the rings onto each other's fingers, the moment felt more real than anything he'd experienced at that cancelled wedding with Victoria. This wasn't about status or a polished performance in front of society. It was about healing, forgiveness, and choosing to be together through choice rather than obligation. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Charlie let out a celebratory whoop, nearly dropping the ring pillow in the process. Laughter spread through the small group of guests, and Jackson drew Lena in for a gentle kiss. It was a full circle he never saw coming but realized he had wanted for a long time, even if he'd been too blind or arrogant to admit it. They stood there for a moment longer, soaking in the applause and the happiness surrounding them. Charlie pushed in between them, hugging them both in a way that almost knocked them off balance. Jackson ruffled Charlie's hair, and Lena squeezed his shoulder, their small family standing together at the very spot where so many truths had come to light. They weren't perfect, but they had become something stronger and more genuine than any of them had imagined. Jackson felt the ring on his finger, the same one he had once offered in youthful optimism, now sealing a promise born from both mistakes and growth. He glanced at Lena, remembering the day Charlie crashed his wedding, the day everything he thought he knew got flipped upside down. He reached for her hand, and she gave it to him easily, turning to face the future without fear. Charlie hopped around, proclaiming that he would definitely plan more fun family vacations, and Jackson just laughed, realizing that from now on, he didn't need to check his schedule to see if he was free. Being with them was the only plan that mattered, and for the first time in his life, that felt more than enough.